We are back, and we are joined now by Omar Baddar, a Middle East policy analyst, here to discuss what the escalating atrocities in the Middle East committed by Israel. Omar, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Of course, good to be with you, Emma.
Good to talk to you. Let's just start with the news that we got overnight that Israel. I saw on Al Jazeera this morning that the death toll is at least 100. They've been bombing tents. Netanyahu has announced that they're essentially seizing territory in the Gaza Strip, and then Israel also bombed Syria overnight as well, and seemingly deployed some troops. And the United States just deployed sent its largest deployment since prior to October 7th, really to back up Israel here. These are major escalations. What's your viewpoint on the past week or 48 hours?
Yeah, it's been an absolute horror show. I really think, just to kind of frame it in a little bit of perspective, this entire Trump administration has sort of been, without exaggeration, the darkest moment of my adult life. And the sheer spread of issues on which they've been horrific it's really hard to quantify. It's everything, what they're doing domestically on accelerating the climate catastrophe, on the conflicts of interest, disregarding the courts, the dismantling of agencies. And yet, even in the midst of all that horror, I think that the part that is the most extreme and grotesque has been what's unfolding in the Middle East, particularly this live stream genocide in Gaza that everybody can watch on their phones and on social media. And the United States' effort to essentially go to a major, devastating regional war in defense of that genocide. That is what we're witnessing. And also the domestic component of this, sort of the crackdown on free speech in the United States. There's so many free speech warriors out there who talk about the importance of free speech and whatever. And yet we see the literal criminalization of speech that is critical of Israel, and people with green cards and student visas being snatched up off the streets for it. And we're still pretending that there's anything normal about this. It's really, really quite apocalyptic as far as I'm concerned. It's very dystopian reality that we're witnessing right now. And in terms of what's unfolding, look, with Gaza, it seems clear that Netanyahu is moving, to use his words, the final stage of what he calls a war. It's really the terminal stage of this genocide.
The final solution. I mean, we're the Gaza Holocaust final solution. That's where we're at.
Effectively. And the crazy part is that there was always this pretense under Biden where Netanyahu always knew that Biden lacked the backbone to stand up to him. But there was always this tension. There was, you're killing too many civilians, and maybe we're going to support a ceasefire, and maybe there's going to be some tension. We might withhold these weapons here and there. Netanyahu was proceeding with a genocide with an effort to bully Biden into supporting it all the way through. And frankly, I think he probably would have been able to bully him all the way through. But with Trump, what you see is Trump comes along and we don't have to pretend anymore. The speeches that Netanyahu used to give in which he says, no, we're not looking to reoccupy Gaza, we're just looking to defeat Hamas. That's not how they talk anymore. Now it's really out in the open where he's saying the goal is to keep squeezing Gaza more and more and more. The Israeli military strategy has always been, for decades now, being used most extremely in Gaza right now, to devastate the civilian population as a means of applying pressure, political pressure, on the people in charge. Sometimes it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, sometimes it's Hamas in Gaza. And that is the dictionary definition of terrorism. Attacking civilians to achieve political change with political aims is terrorism. So you have a policy of mass terrorism reaching genocidal levels. And Netanyahu is saying that now, after we break Hamas, force them to release all the hostages and agree to basically no longer govern Gaza, surrender, then from there, the path forward is implementation of Trump's plan, what he calls voluntary displacement. There's nothing voluntary about it. When you've destroyed a place's ability to sustain life, and you've destroyed every hospital, and you've mass killed children by the tens of thousands, and there's rubble everywhere, and you're not going to allow them to rebuild, that is not a voluntary exit for people who choose not to live in that anymore. It is obviously the act of ethnic cleansing on the back of a genocide. And that's the plan if Hamas surrenders. So it tells you that there's no prospect for Palestinians at all to sustain the ability to maintain a society in Gaza as long as Trump and Netanyahu are allowed to continue on the rampage that they're continuing with.
Trump and Netanyahu in that first meeting basically revealed it, where Trump said, why would they want to go back? It's uninhabitable. And Netanyahu was smirking, saying it in the passive voice as if the man wasn't sitting right next to him who had committed these atrocities. And on the mask off, really, in terms of Netanyahu's rhetoric, let's play a little bit of this. This was Wednesday, so yesterday. And I'll read over the captions for the podcast audience because this is in Hebrew, but this is him saying that basically they're going to take land in Gaza, and we'll show how that looks on a map in just a second. Last night in the Gaza Strip, we switched gears. The IDF is seizing territory, striking the terrorists, and destroying the infrastructure. We are also doing something else. We are seizing the North Corridor. There will be the second Philadelphi, an additional Philadelphi corridor, because we are now dividing the strip and increasing the pressure step by step so that they will give us our hostages. And as long as they do not give them to us, the pressure will increase until they do. We are determined to achieve the objectives of the war, and we are attacking relentlessly and with a clear line and a clear mission. Well, that part's true. All right, well, whatever. God's help. It's a holy mission to exterminate this population. This is the image of the land that he's describing here. Now, people who aren't familiar, the Philadelphi Corridor is essentially the border between the southern part of... Sorry, something's playing. Yeah. The Philadelphi Corridor is the southern border between Egypt and the southern border of the Gaza Strip, and basically Netanyahu and the Israelis have insisted on maintaining a permanent military presence there, and that was a part of this, the ceasefire negotiations. Hamas and some of the partners in their negotiations didn't want that, obviously. Now, here is the Morag axis that he's describing. This basically is Israel seemingly creating a buffer zone for their buffer zone, which is their excuse to just continuously take more territory. I mean, they're taking Rafah and everything south of it, according to Netanyahu's own statements right there.
That's exactly right. And by the way, the name of that corridor is named after the Israeli settlement that used to be there, illegal Israeli settlement that was built in the heart of Gaza many years ago. And so it's another signal of their intent to essentially permanently take control over parts of the Gaza Strip, at least, if not the entire thing. And the biggest lie of all this is that this has anything to do with the hostages. Right. It's been clear from day one that Hamas had offered to effectively release all the hostages in exchange for an end to this genocide. And Israel has repeatedly rejected that. And ultimately, it was a proposal that was presented by Biden for a ceasefire. Israel rejected out of hand. American politicians are just experts at gaslighting the American public about who's responsible for rejecting ceasefires. They blamed Hamas, even though that's obviously not the case in terms of what actually unfolded in the negotiations. Trump comes along and forces Israel to accept the deal that was offered by Biden, but tells them it's only temporary, don't worry about it, get some hostages out, and then do whatever you want. And sure enough, Israel gets some hostages back, then decides to violate virtually every other aspect of that deal. They don't let in the aid that they promised they would let into Gaza. They maintain control of the areas that they promised they would leave. It's supposed to be a ceasefire, and yet Israel kills more than 120 Palestinians in Gaza throughout that so-called ceasefire, and refuses to begin phase 2 of the negotiations that's supposed to be the permanent end to hostilities. And when Hamas says, no, we're not down with you violating every rule, Israel says, okay, fine, I guess we're going to go back to the genocide, and just unleashes it. And then American politicians once again line up to say Hamas is to blame for the ceasefire falling apart. I mean, it really, Orwell would be rolling in his grave if he ever knew how unbelievably, what was supposed to be cartoonish and over the top is exactly the reality that we're presented right now, where there's complete and total disregard to the reality that's actually unfolding, and a complete reversal of the role of perpetrator and victim in this entire saga.
Yeah, I mean, Netanyahu said it in that the IDF is seizing territory. That was the quote. And that is an open admission what they've basically denied the entire time under the Biden administration. And they've also not been successful in their stated goal of defeating Hamas, which we know that, like the hostages, is just a pretense for continued slaughter. Where is Hamas in all of this at this current moment? Because I think we can view these attacks as well as Trump doing Israel's dirty work, bombing the Houthis, also this escalation in Syria now that, Bashar al-Assad has fled to Russia. These all appear like provocations towards Iran, although obviously the first order issue for Netanyahu and the Israelis is to do the final solution in Gaza.
Yeah, look, for Hamas, from the beginning, I think their calculus, starting with October 7th and long before, for that matter. Obviously, Gaza was unlivable before this genocide even commenced after October 7th. The economy was in shambles. It was under siege. Palestinians could not go in and out of Gaza. They were not allowed to have an airport, no seaport, can't trade with the outside world. And then Israel could just bomb whatever parts of Gaza it wanted at will. And so you had a captive population that was desperate for a way out of the situation. Hamas's calculus was to stage an over-the-top attack on October 7th, thinking that they'll withstand whatever Israeli retaliation comes. There's no denying that we know what Israel's modus operandi is, that anytime there's any kind of Palestinian attack, all Israel does in return is escalate its devastation of civilians to just an unbelievable degree. And Hamas was prepared to deal with that to some extent. They were expecting that Israel was going to retaliate. It was going to be brutal. Probably a lot of their leaders going to be killed. But ultimately, they thought they could survive it, and that the only way that Israel could achieve victory is that they were allowed to fully genocide the Palestinian population in Gaza, which they believed was impossible. That it's, 2023, 2024, 2025, we're past the era where you can just annihilate a people in a way that can be live streamed on social media, right, and that the world would put up with it. Their calculus has proved to be completely wrong. And I think they're now stuck in a situation where they don't know what to do anymore. They don't want to surrender because the devastation of Gaza, they don't want it to essentially all be for nothing from their perspective. They've already lost everything. And so they're probably going to fight tooth and nail for the sake of salvaging something out of this. And if that means nothing at all, then they would rather having died fighting rather than just surrendering and allowing Israel to expand its territory even further and suffocate Palestinians even more and to get away with the atrocities that they have committed. The broader dynamic, though, I think has also been interesting, is that you have groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Right.
They were a serious military rival to Israel. And they had accumulated a certain level of military power that they were no longer intimidated by Israel. And Israel, frankly, was afraid of the prospect of a full-on confrontation with Hezbollah. But then
it looks like in southern Lebanon for a period that Hezbollah was winning the ground war, and that the IDF was being very cagey about the level of destruction they were experiencing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, they achieved something incredible with the intelligence penetration of Hezbollah, the pagers attack and the walkie-talkies, and being able to locate their entire top leadership and to eliminate them is something that nobody saw coming. There was a very, very deep intelligence hole within Hezbollah that Israel exploited. And Israel thought that on the back of that means Hezbollah is finished, so we can just march in and probably march to the Litani River or even further into Beirut. And they found out that that was not the case, that just because Hezbollah was decapitated doesn't mean that its fighters on the ground were going to give up. And they put up very, very fierce resistance and essentially pushed the Israelis back. So now we have this so-called ceasefire in Lebanon, in which Hezbollah is diminished politically, having lost its political leadership entirely, and wanting to, at this point, abide by a ceasefire, but Israel is not giving them breathing room. They keep bombing Lebanon. They've bombed Lebanon virtually every day throughout this entire so-called ceasefire. And then on one occasion, some unknown person fires rockets out of South Lebanon, and Israel retaliates by bombing the capital, Beirut. So the rules of the game from Israel's perspective are, we do whatever the hell we want. We bomb whoever we want. And if anybody ever dares to object or retaliate in any way, then we're just going to unleash far greater violence. It is the rules of a mobster. It's a bully. And the only party left in the entire region that Israel does see as a threat is Iran. And the fear right now is that we are, I don't think that the Trump administration is individually motivated to go to a war with Iran. It doesn't serve American interests. It doesn't serve Iranian interests. Nobody wants this war, with the exception of Israel. Israel is the only party in the entire region and the entire world that is eager to drag the US into a confrontation with Iran, because Israel knows it can't take on Iran by itself and needs the US to be involved in order for them to achieve that regime change that, from Israel's perspective, would change the entire dynamic in the region and would complete the project of complete and total Israeli dominance over the entire area, where nobody can object or defy or say anything to the fact that Israel is going to take whatever land it wants and massacre whoever they want and ethnically cleanse whatever part they want.
But they're already doing that, which begs the question, why even risk a confrontation with Iran here if you're behaving in a way that is rational? I mean, these are not rational actors. Like, I'm flummoxed by the fact that, like, even in this position where Israel's spilling all the blood that they want, that we're back here. I mean, Netanyahu quoted after 9/11 saying, "Oh, this will be good for us," and then receding on that point, testifying in the early 2000s, saying that the United States needs to get involved in Iraq, and it was integral in building up the opposition to the Iran nuclear deal, which in hindsight, frankly, Obama, it was maybe his greatest achievement, because people don't understand how much the Israel lobby that currently right now is wreaking havoc over our politics was deeply opposed to it. Netanyahu did this PowerPoint presentation claiming Iran was cheating on the nuclear deal that had no real evidence behind it. This goes back to, really, honestly, decades, Israel's desire to escalate with Iran. Yeah. Now that they're doing whatever the hell they want, they're still on this thing?
So, two parts. Just on the doing whatever the hell they want, part of why they went genocidal in Gaza is to restore what they call Israeli deterrence. Israel believes that its survival depends on bullying everybody into being quiet and being afraid and shrinking. And the fact that you have Hezbollah in Lebanon, certainly battered and pushed back from the border, but not defeated and has the possibility of rearming and, refinding its strength once more. You have the fact that the Houthis in Yemen are not intimidated. They also receive support from Iran, and they're not afraid to fire missiles and to continue the blockade in the Red Sea, to try to put pressure on Israel to end the genocide in Gaza. So there's a world in which the region's intimidation is not complete. There's still some resistance, and that, from Israel's perspective, is unacceptable. And the way to deal with it once and for all is, and by the way, a lot of people refer to other groups in the region as proxies of Iran. I don't think that's a correct understanding of what the relationship is. These are not tools of Iran. These are individual groups. Hezbollah in Lebanon is a fully Lebanese group. It is, Lebanese.
They're allied with Iran.
That's right. So Iran looks for people in the region who can be in alliance essentially with them because they have the same goals, and they decide to support them and arm them. That doesn't make these groups proxies of Iran. They simply makes them allies of Iran who, in which there's a common strategic goal in terms of the region. And the nuclear deal, it was never about the nuclear deal as far as Israel is concerned. The fact that Obama was able to achieve that nuclear deal that definitely prevented Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons in a way that is verifiable. Israel was the biggest opponent of that deal, which tells you that it was never about Iran's nuclear weapons program. What they want is enough pressure on Iran to capitulate. They want submission to the idea that Iran is not going to challenge Israeli dominance in the region. It's not going to arm or fund groups that are opponents of Israel. That's what they ultimately want, which is why they screwed up the deal and talked Trump into canceling that deal. And you have now, again, just forget the details of it. The idea that the United States, a nuclear-armed country that is the only country in the world to have used nuclear weapons, and you have another country, Israel, in the region that is also nuclear-armed, undeclared nuclear weapons, but everybody in the world knows that Israel has them.
Yes, thanks to the US and the CIA.
Yeah. And to have that dynamic where these countries are saying it's unacceptable for Iran to acquire nuclear weapons on the threat of annihilation of that country. Just think of the hypocrisy, the breakdown of the most elementary moral principle, the principle of universality, that the rules should apply to everyone. And US policy is openly that the rules should only apply to Iran and not to Israel.
Right.
And on top of that, the US intelligence assessment is that there's no evidence that Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons. What they have is a civilian nuclear power plant that has the potential to be converted into military, should they choose to do that one day in the future. But all indications as of now is that there is no indication that Iran is interested in acquiring a nuclear weapon. Their religious leaders have said that we oppose that in principle. And Iran is using this nuclear acceleration as a point of leverage to try to lift the devastating economic sanctions that the US has imposed on Iran. They want a return to the status quo where there are no devastating economic sanctions and the people of Iran can actually enjoy some level of economic prosperity. And in exchange, there is a verifiable guarantee that Iran cannot develop nuclear weapons, and having international inspectors in there. That's the deal we had under Obama. Anybody who's serious about wanting to avoid a war, it's obvious what the path to that is. You go back to a deal that you had in place. And yet we have this utter lunacy right now where Trump is saying we're going to keep devastating you economically and imposing these sanctions on you. And even though we have no indication that you're developing nuclear weapons, the fact that you're even building up a civilian nuclear program is not acceptable to us. And now we're threatening that we might go to war and having this massive military buildup in the region. This would be the most catastrophic war in certainly my living time on this planet, as far as the US is concerned.
Exponentially larger than Iraq, terrain that is very mountainous and difficult for US military personnel to understand. And not that I would be so opposed to this, but just from the strategic perspective, it would be a quagmire that would make Iraq look like, child's play, basically, if we were to actually get into a war with Iran.
And remember how devastating Iraq was. The fact that you've lost more than 1 million people in that country.
Yep.
That even if you ignore, sadly, it's the reality of American media discourse. Even if you ignore the destruction in Iraq and the devastation of the Iraqi population, from the US perspective, everybody sees Iraq as a quagmire and a massive strategic mistake that endlessly killed American soldiers, shifted the regions of the dynamic not in the United States' favor, had Iran expanded its influence, had the emergence of ISIS. And you can imagine taking on a player like Iran, which has been preparing for the possibility of a regime change war, has a massive arsenal of rockets that can reach any part of the Middle East, and people who are ideologically committed to the idea of dragging this fight as long as possible. We are looking at a far infinitely worse situation should something like that actually proceed. And there is, again, people who voted for Trump on the illusion that he's the anti-war candidate. At this point, looking at what's happening right now, those ought to be the loudest voices saying this insanity has to come to an end. We can't allow this to drag on. And for what? All in defense of Israel's genocide in Gaza. The idea that you are willing to devastate the entire world and risk American interests in defense of nothing good, in defense of a genocide, for heaven's sake. It's beyond grotesque and beyond ugly and contemptible, the fact that we've allowed our politics to get to this point.
And the point that, you were saying earlier on about how the Biden administration, or Netanyahu, was manipulating him and was very successful at really bullying him. At the very least, Biden's voters, right? Some of them. And this is what the point I was making about why I thought Kamala Harris would be a better option here. There's a constituency that will push back on what the president is doing, essentially. Like the Democratic voters, there are some, it's not enough, but some that will raise some hell. The thing with Trump is that he's basically untethered to any constituency that cares about this. You look at poll numbers with Republicans, they're as pro-Israel as anything. It doesn't really necessarily... they like the idea of an ethnically pure colonizing state in the Middle East that's just killing all Muslim people that are threats to Western civilization or whatever. But in terms of... And I'll wrap up here with you, Omar. Israel's position as a pariah state, despite in the short term, being able to escalate its genocidal acts. I was struck by, I think there was an article in Times of Israel a week or so ago about Saudi Arabia's viewpoint, and there was some analysis of the prospects of normalization with Israel, and how it's on a bit of shakier ground because Saudi Arabia has global ambitions that aren't just about security guarantees with the United States, that aren't just about weapon sales or potentially giving them a nuclear weapon, which is a part of the Abraham Accord negotiations. Saudi Arabia also has to weigh, okay, these two, this bloated empire and its proxy state in the Middle East that's committing genocide, they're in some sort of like suicide cult pact. Like, I've got to look elsewhere and think about how my normalization with Israel might affect trade relationships in the future. And then you pair that with how China kind of got Iran and Saudi Arabia together at the bargaining table when it came to Yemen. Is there a shift here? I'm looking for some hope, but is Saudi Arabia going to see that maybe my interests don't really necessarily align with continuing to tie myself to the U.S. here, and I could find this security elsewhere?
I don't think we're quite at that tipping point yet, but there are certainly indications of it. I think the Saudi Arabia remains, in the U.S. orbit for the foreseeable future, but they do see the writing on the wall, the fact that things are not looking good right now. They don't know where things are heading. And from Israel's perspective, too, they understand that they are paying a very, very significant cost in their reputation around the world. I mean, Israeli leaders are wanted. They have warrants for their arrest by the International Criminal Court for the crime of extermination, for starving a civilian population. There is no recovering from that in the short term. But what Israel sees is a small window of opportunity with Donald Trump, where they know this set of circumstances is not going to present itself again. And they think that they can get away with whatever they need to get away with whatever they can in the meantime, because the shifting sails of American public opinion, the future of American policy, there's clear indication that 20 years from now, Israel could not do this with American support. Young people in the United States, 40 and under, understand very well why this is morally reprehensible and strategically idiotic. And so Israel is trying to do as much damage as possible in as short a time as possible. From their perspective, I think they're imagining a US scenario with Native Americans where, yeah, sure, history will look back and think this was terrible, but what's done is done, and you can just move on and normalize. I think they're miscalculating. I think their reading is incorrect. We're at a very, very different stage of time in the world where the consequences for their behavior are going to be coming up much, much quicker. Reality is going to sit in harder. It's not going to spare Palestinians in the meantime, unfortunately. I think Palestinians are still going to receive the brunt of that brutality. We're going to see deaths continue at an unprecedented rate. The West Bank might be next. But I do agree that in the long term, Israel could be potentially setting itself up for collapse by insisting on carrying out this genocide in full view of the entire world and thinking that this is going to be the path for them to security and prosperity, when all you're doing is entrenching deeply hostile attitudes throughout the entire region and beyond for the fact that this set of criminals has been allowed to behave the way that they have.
Omar Baddar, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.